Welcome to the deep dive. You reached out curious about Vietnam, and we're about to take a really fascinating trip through its history.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a great resource to guide us. A Brief History of Vietnam by Associate Professor Dr. Afisvad Sirivathanawartavachara. And it covers, well, a huge amount of ground.
Right.
From the country's geography and its ancient roots all the way through to modern developments and, its place in the world today.
Exactly. So our mission here is to go beyond just like the dates and names and really dig into what makes Vietnam's long story so compelling. We want to pull out the key insights, the surprising twists, and ultimately give you a real understanding of how this nation has been shaped. Okay, so where do we even begin with a history that stretches back millennia?
Well, let's start by maybe painting a picture of the land itself. Vietnam is strategically located in Southeast Asia. It shares borders with China to the north and Laos and Cambodia to the west. It's a long, slender country, right? Stretching roughly 1,100 kilometers north to south, but it's only averaging about 270 kilometers wide.
Wow, that's narrow in places.
It is. And this long coastline, over 3,260 kilometers, plus maybe 4,000 islands dotted around. That's given Vietnam a historically strong connection to the sea, and today it's home to around 100 million people.
That shape alone sort of suggests a story of connection, maybe, but perhaps also internal divisions over time. But the history, it goes much deeper than its modern borders, doesn't it? We're talking roots over 4,000 years old.
Oh, absolutely.
And the region is recognized as a very early center for agriculture in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that Vietnam wasn't just an early agricultural center. It was a cultural crossroads. We see this significant and sustained influence from southern Chinese migration, starting as early as the 3rd century BCE. This brought new ideas, new technologies, impacting pretty much everything, language, music, food, political structures.
It's interesting thinking about that early interaction. Was it just a straightforward adoption of Chinese culture or something else? The source hints at resistance?
Yeah, and that resistance is absolutely crucial to understanding Vietnamese identity. Unlike maybe some of its neighbors, Vietnam consistently pushed back against these periods of Chinese domination.
Right.
And this wasn't just military conflict, it was cultural defense, you could say. The result is this really unique blend. You see Chinese influences, for sure, but they're woven into existing indigenous traditions and beliefs. It created something distinctly Vietnamese, not just like a copy of Chinese culture.
So right from the start, we see this theme of like absorbing outside influences but fiercely maintaining a sense of self. And even before these major migrations, the land itself has a deep history of human habitation.
Indeed. Vietnam was among the earliest places outside Africa where modern humans settled, H. sapiens. We have evidence going back maybe 30,000 years. And in terms of agriculture, the north of Vietnam was a key area for the early development of rice cultivation, starting around, say, 5,500 to 5,000 years ago. And this innovation then spread.
Okay.
What's particularly noteworthy, though, is central Vietnam, specifically Quang Nam and Quang Ngai provinces, seems to have been another perhaps independent and early center for the transition to farming. We've found rice paddy remains there dating back about 3,000 years.
So multiple origins, perhaps?
It suggests that, multiple centers of agricultural development in the region.
It's amazing thinking about these ancient roots and how they set the stage. Let's move on to the early kingdoms and that fascinating Dong Son culture. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, the Dong Son culture. It emerges around 5,000 BCE, mainly in the Red River Delta, and it's really significant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it coincided with the further development of wet rice cultivation, which, as we said, became the backbone of the Vietnamese economy and way of life. Secondly, the Dong Son people were incredibly skilled in bronze casting. They produced some truly remarkable artifacts.
Bronze casting, metalworking.
Exactly. They were proficient farmers, too, not just rice raising, livestock, fishing, but their metalworking skills were exceptional. Archaeologists found a huge range of stuff. Tools, weapons, pottery, seals made of different materials, and of course, those iconic bronze drums.
Right, these bronze drums keep coming up. What made them so central to this early culture?
Well, they weren't just musical instruments, though they were used for music, too. They were deeply symbolic, multifunctional.
Okay.
These drums played a key role in Dong Son society. They were used in important discussions during marriage ceremonies and religious worship, even to celebrate military victories.
How versatile.
Very. And the artistry on the drums themselves is striking, often intricate depictions of daily life, mythical creatures. Their use was also linked to specific types of music and dance, and to early religious beliefs like lion dancing and the worship of forest spirits. Think of them as both a technological achievement and a really vital cultural object.
So the Dongsun culture gives us this glimpse into a sophisticated early society, established farming, advanced metalworking, rich cultural rituals. And the source also mentions the very early kingdoms of Van Lang and Au Lac. Are these like historical realities or more legend?
Well, there's definitely a degree of legend mixed in with the history, no doubt. But archaeological findings and references in later records, from neighboring cultures, they suggest these were indeed early forms of organized society.
Okay.
The foundation of Van Lang, for instance, is tentatively dated back to maybe the 7th century BC. The name itself, Van Lang, means something like civilized lands and waters, which probably reflects how important water and agriculture were.
Makes sense.
So these early kingdoms, while maybe not as documented as later periods, they represent crucial steps in developing a distinct Vietnamese identity. They laid down some of the foundational myths and narratives.
Okay, so from these early kingdoms, we then enter this really long stretch of Chinese domination over 2,000 years, you said.
Yeah, it's a huge chunk of time.
For someone unfamiliar with the history, that sounds like it would just fundamentally reshape the culture. How did the Vietnamese people navigate such a long period of outside rule?
It was indeed a long and complex period, spanning 5 distinct phases, different Chinese dynasties, from 111 BCE all the way to 938 AD. You had the Western and Eastern Han, Wei, Wu, Liang, Chen, Sui, Tang, a whole succession.
Right.
But as we touched on earlier, the Vietnamese people were not just passive recipients of Chinese culture. Resistance was a constant factor.
Okay.
And what's really insightful here is that the Chinese influence, while significant, it primarily impacted the ruling elite, the nobility. The majority of the population, the farmers, the artisans, they remained largely connected to their indigenous languages, their beliefs, their customs. So while the ruling class might adopt Confucianism or Chinese administrative practices, the everyday lives of most Vietnamese people kept a strong sense of their own cultural heritage.
That's a really important distinction. So not a complete cultural takeover. And within this long period, there must have been moments of significant resistance. The story of the Trung sisters is one that many might have heard of. Can you tell us more about their rebellion?
Oh, absolutely. The rebellion of the Trung sisters in 39 AD is a truly iconic moment in Vietnamese history. It really embodies that spirit of resistance we just discussed.
Okay.
Trung Trac and Trung He, they came from a local noble family. Their father, a respected leader, was apparently humiliated by the Chinese governor, To Dinh, and supposedly forced to take his own life. So this personal tragedy, combined with the generally oppressive nature of Chinese rule, it fueled their determination to seek revenge and, liberate their people. Trung Trac was also married to Thi Sac, who was involved in resistance too, but he was eventually executed by the Chinese, which just further galvanized the sisters.
So it was both personal and a broader uprising against injustice. What happened next? How did they actually manage it?
Well, driven by their vow, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi rallied support from various local leaders and communities who were also, chafing under Chinese rule. They launched a surprisingly well-coordinated uprising.
Really?
Yeah, and remarkably, their forces captured something like 65 towns and strongholds. To Dinh, the hated governor, he was forced to flee.
Incredible.
The Trung sisters then declared themselves queens, with Trung Trac as the primary ruler, taking the name Trung Vuong. For a brief period, Vietnam regained its name and a sense of self-rule. And their leadership was significant. They commanded troops, protected civilians, organized supplies, even created maps. Their success really inspired widespread unity.
It's an incredible story, 2 women leading a successful revolt against a major empire. But sadly, this independence didn't last, did it?
No, unfortunately not. The Chinese Emperor Han Guangwu eventually sent a much larger, much better-equipped army, led by the General Ma Vin, to crush the rebellion. And despite fierce and valiant resistance from the Trung sisters and their forces, they were ultimately defeated in 43 AD. To avoid capture, the story goes, they tragically took their own lives by drowning in a river, which, still bears their name today.
Wow.
But despite the short-lived nature of their rule, the Trung sisters became these enduring symbols of Vietnamese courage, patriotism, and that refusal to be subjugated. Their story is still a powerful source of national pride.
Their legacy clearly lived on. So after this really extended period of domination, how did Vietnam eventually forge a more lasting path to independence? What were the key milestones?
Well, the first real steps towards sustained independence emerged probably in the 9th century. This was when the Tang dynasty in China was weakening, allowing local powers to rise up. The Tang dynasty briefly established itself after defeating another local dynasty, the Duan.
Okay.
However, it was really the Li kings who came to power around the end of the 10th century. This was after Nguyen Quan's decisive victory against a later Chinese invasion in 938. They're the ones credited with really laying the foundations for a distinct and enduring Vietnamese nationality.
How so? What did they do differently?
They established a stable central government,
Huh.
and crucially, they made Thang Long, which is basically modern-day Hanoi, their capital. They recognized its strategic importance for defense, especially against future threats from the north.
And it wasn't just about military strength, was it? The source mentions economic developments under the Li dynasty that helped build this sense of national identity.
Absolutely, that's a key point. The Li dynasty implemented significant economic reforms. They even issued their own local currency coins made of gold, copper, tin. This fostered trade, both internally and with neighboring countries. We also see a shift in how the kingdom was organized. It moved beyond just purely agricultural units based on rice paddies to encompass growing urban centers.
Okay, so cities started becoming more important.
Exactly. The development of Tham Long as a royal city spurred the growth of artisan crafts, horticulture. It created a more diversified economy and a stronger sense of a unified territory, beyond just the rural villages.
And Thang Long continued to flourish under later dynasties like the Trun, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Dai La, which became Tham Long, was already a significant urban center even before the Li. By the Lai and Tran periods, it apparently boasted well-developed horticulture and over 50 bustling markets.
50 markets.
Yeah, quite something. Artisans there were highly skilled in various crafts, sophisticated metalworking, goldsmithing. Even earlier, Lê Huron, founder of the earlier Lê dynasty, had recognized Thang Long's strategic advantages and made it his capital. The subsequent Li and Trent rulers just continued to invest in its infrastructure, roads, bridges, even flood control systems, solidifying its role as the political and economic heart of Vietnam.
But the road to a truly stable, unified, independent Vietnam still had its bumps, didn't it? The Ming occupation in the early 15th century sounds like another major challenge.
Indeed. Back to the cycle. In 1414, the Ming dynasty of China once again asserted control over Annam, mainly aiming to exploit its rich agricultural resources.
Right.
However, this period of occupation was met with, again, fierce and ultimately successful resistance, this time led by the brilliant strategist Lê Lợi.
Lê Lợi.
Yeah. After years of struggle, his forces decisively defeated the Ming in 1427. He established the later Lê dynasty, ushering in another really crucial era of Vietnamese independence.
So a constant cycle. External threats, internal resilience. But even after getting independence back from the Ming, internal peace wasn't guaranteed, was it? That long civil war between the Le and Mac clans sounds particularly disruptive.
It really was a protracted and destabilizing conflict. Starting in 1527, the Mac dynasty managed to seize control of Thang Long, challenging the Lo ruler's authority.
Okay.
And even after the Le were nominally restored, their actual power remained pretty weak. Real authority was increasingly held by powerful regional families, particularly the Trinh in the north and the Nguyen in the south.
The Trinh and Nguyen lords?
Exactly. For over 2 centuries, basically from the 16th to the 18th, Vietnam was effectively divided. The Trinh lords ruled the north from Hanoi, technically in the name of the Lê emperors, while the Nguyen lords governed the south from Ho. This prolonged internal division, it caused significant hardship and instability for the Vietnamese people.
It sounds like a period of really great upheaval, kind of setting the stage for the arrival of European powers in the 19th century.
Precisely. After a brief period of reunification under Nguyen Hut of the Tai Son dynasty, another figure, Nguyen An, managed to establish the Nguyen dynasty in 1802. And crucially, he did this with support from French and other foreign interests.
The French connection begins.
Right. While initially it was maybe focused on trade, French interest in Vietnam as a market and a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia grew rapidly. By 1858, the French military had launched its campaign to establish control.
And that led to?
By 1887, Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, had become part of what the French called French Indochina, full colonial rule.
And as we've seen throughout Vietnamese history, this colonization was not met with open arms, I imagine.
No, definitely not. There was significant and sustained Vietnamese resistance against French rule right from the start. Despite this, the French implemented a system of often brutal economic and political exploitation.
Like what specifically?
Well, one policy that caused huge resentment was granting large tracts of land, often prime agricultural land, to Chinese immigrant laborers. This displaced many Vietnamese peasants and led to numerous revolts.
Beyond the direct exploitation of resources, how did French colonization impact Vietnamese society in the longer term?
Well, French colonization brought about significant transformations, both positive and negative, depending on your perspective. They developed infrastructure transport systems, factories, and introduced large-scale agriculture geared towards the global market.
Okay.
This led to the emergence of a wealthier capitalist class and a growing urban middle class. French literature and a trilingual education system were introduced, which had a profound impact on intellectual and cultural life.
Right, education and culture.
And perhaps one of the most significant changes was the introduction of printing and the press. This really facilitated the spread of new ideas, fostered a sense of national consciousness, and played a crucial role in developing modern Vietnamese literature and political thought.
So even within the context of colonial rule, there were these seeds of change and new forms of cultural expression. And even early on, there was a reaction against this French influence.
Yes, definitely. Even under Emperor Jialong's successor, Minh Mang, who came to power relatively early in the 19th century, there was a strong effort to resist and eliminate the growing influence of Catholicism and other Western ideas.
Why Catholicism specifically?
Minh Mang was a staunch Confucianist. He sought to maintain traditional Vietnamese values and social structures and saw Catholicism as a disruptive foreign force. Interestingly, as direct opposition proved difficult, Vietnamese intellectuals and officials began to subtly adapt and integrate French and Catholic terms into their own discourse, creating what the source calls a countertextual regime to resist colonial ideology from within.
Fascinating, using the colonizers' language against them, in a way. Let's move on to the dramatic period of World War II and the Japanese occupation. How did that impact Vietnam?
Well, the fall of France to Nazi Germany in 1940 was a major turning point. It significantly weakened French control over Indochina. Japan, already expanding its influence in Asia, saw an opportunity and moved in.
So the French were out?
Not entirely, initially. Japan effectively divided French Indochina into different zones of control. While the French initially retained some administrative functions, particularly in the south, Japan exerted overall military and political dominance, especially in Tonkin and central Vietnam, starting around September 1940.
Was there maybe an initial hope among some Vietnamese nationalists that the Japanese might liberate them from the French, similar to what happened elsewhere?
There was indeed an initial expectation among some Vietnamese, that Japan, as another Asian power, might help expel the French. However, Japan's primary goal was securing resources and strategic advantage in Southeast Asia.
Not liberation, then.
No, they chose to maintain a weakened French administration to handle day-to-day stuff while they held the real power. It was pragmatic for Japan, not really about Vietnamese independence at that stage.
So a different kind of occupation with its own set of consequences.
Absolutely. Southeast Asia became a crucial theater in World War II. Japan's interest in Indochina intensified after 1940, especially as it provided a strategic link to Southeast Asia and a way to cut off supplies to China, who they'd been at war with since 1937.
Right.
Interestingly, the Japanese also made efforts to learn more about Vietnamese culture, economy, history, geography, even compiled a Japanese-Vietnamese dictionary. Suggests maybe a longer-term interest beyond just immediate military needs.
And this period of shifting external powers created an opening for Vietnamese nationalist movements, didn't it? The rise of the Viet Minh becomes really key here.
Exactly. The Japanese coup of March 1945, where they finally just kicked out the French administration entirely, ironically created a power vacuum. And Vietnamese nationalist groups were ready to exploit it.
Especially the Viet Minh.
Most notably, the Viet Minh. Led by Ho Chi Minh. They'd been active for years, but the changing circumstances of the war gave them a new opportunity. They reorganized, put forward a manifesto focusing on local needs, land reform, nationalism, democracy, economic development. Their initial aim wasn't necessarily immediate independence, but events moved fast.
With the atomic bombings and Japan's sudden surrender in August 1945, things must have moved very quickly in Vietnam.
Incredibly quickly. Following Japan's surrender, the Viet Minh moved swiftly to consolidate power across the country. They formed the National Insurrection Committee, the People's National Congress, called for a general uprising.
And it worked.
Remarkably, yes. The transfer of power in many rural areas, even in cities, was largely peaceful. Emperor Bao Dai, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abdicated on August 25, 1945, a significant end to the old imperial order.
A brief moment of apparent independence, but it was soon followed by the First Indochina War against the returning French.
That's right. The First Indochina War, lasting from 1946 to 1954, erupted as the French tried to reestablish their colonial control. The conflict saw periods of intense fighting, like a major battle in the Red River Delta in 1947, but also periods of less direct confrontation.
And the international context was shifting dramatically then with the rise of communism in China. How did that impact the war?
Oh, hugely. The communist victory in China in 1949 gave the Viet Minh a crucial ally on their border. They started receiving substantial military and logistical support from China, which significantly strengthened their capabilities.
And the other side, the French.
Well, in response, particularly after the Korean War broke out in 1950, the French started getting increasing amounts of military aid from the United States. The U.S. was driven by the domino theory, the fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. So the conflict got increasingly tangled up in the bigger Cold War rivalry.
So it became a proxy conflict in many ways. But despite the increasing American support, the French ultimately suffered that decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. What made that battle such a turning point?
Dien Bien Phu was a massive strategic and symbolic victory for the Viet Minh. Their forces, under General Von Nguyen Giap, managed to surround and just overwhelm a heavily fortified French base in this remote valley.
How?
Well, the French military strategy proved outdated, ill-suited to the terrain, and frankly, underestimated the Viet Minh. Even the influx of American arms couldn't compensate for these strategic errors and the sheer determination of the Viet Minh forces. Dien Bien Phu clearly showed the limits of French colonial power and was a major catalyst for ending the war.
Which led directly to the Geneva Accords and the partitioning of Vietnam. Can you explain the terms of those agreements? What did they actually say?
Okay, the Geneva Conference in July 1954 resulted in the Geneva Accords, officially ending the First Indochina War. The key outcome was the temporary partitioning of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Supposedly temporary, yes. It created two zones. North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and South Vietnam. The accords called for the French to withdraw and Viet Minh forces to pull back to the north. Crucially, nationwide elections were planned for 1956 to reunify the country.
But those elections never happened, and the U.S. had strong objections to this outcome, right?
That's correct. The United States strongly opposed the division, viewing any communist control as a defeat and fearing that domino effect across Southeast Asia.
So they prevented the elections.
Well, the communist side had actually made some concessions in Geneva, expecting they'd easily win the planned reunification elections. But the U.S. actively supported the anti-communist government in South Vietnam under Nung Ngo Dinh Diem, and those elections were never held. This failure to reunify basically set the stage for the next phase of conflict, the escalation, and eventually the Vietnam War.
Or as it's known in Vietnam, the American War. This conflict saw just massive international involvement and devastating consequences for Vietnam.
Absolutely. As tensions and violence between North and South Vietnam escalated through the late 50s and early 60s, the United States' involvement just deepened. Initially, it was advisors, counterinsurgency units, assisting the South Vietnamese military. The Saigon regime was fighting its own war of people against the communist insurgency, the Viet Cong.
But then came the troops.
Right. President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision in March 1965 to deploy U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam marked that critical turning point. That's when it really became the American War. The U.S. established a huge military presence, the 7th Fleet Command offshore, massive expansion of bases and infrastructure in South Vietnam.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 is often cited as the key event that led to this major escalation. What exactly happened there, or what was claimed to happen?
The incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964 were definitely pivotal. They provided the Johnson administration with the political justification it sought for a major increase in U.S. military engagement. However, the precise details, what actually happened in the water, and the interpretation of those events, well, that remains a subject of significant historical debate and controversy even today.
Right. And the war itself was marked by intense and impactful events, perhaps none more so than the Tet Offensive in 1968. What was the significance of Tet?
Launched in January 1968 during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, the Tet Offensive was this series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. They targeted major cities, towns, military bases all across South Vietnam, including the capital, Saigon itself.
A huge gamble.
It was. And while the offensive was ultimately repelled militarily by the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces after weeks of heavy fighting, its psychological and political impact was profound, especially back in the United States.
How?
It basically shattered the prevailing narrative that the North Vietnamese were weakening and that the U.S. was winning the war. It demonstrated their ability to launch these large-scale, coordinated attacks deep into South Vietnam. The brief infiltration of the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, even just getting inside the walls, and the really fierce fighting in the old imperial city of Hue that was particularly shocking to the American public and significantly shifted public opinion against the war.
And the Vietnam War wasn't just Vietnam and the U.S. It had significant international dimensions, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The war became a major focal point of international politics. It galvanized both support for North Vietnam and opposition to the U.S. involvement worldwide.
Right.
You had things like the International Front of Peace and Solidarity in Indochina established, bringing together various groups against the war. Countries like Indonesia, the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia provided significant support to North Vietnam. The conflict was constantly debated at the United Nations, and huge anti-war protests erupted across the globe. It deeply divided the international community.
After years of just devastating conflict, the war finally concluded, leading to the reunification of Vietnam. What were the immediate steps taken after the fall of Saigon in April 1975?
Well, following the liberation of South Vietnam, the new government moved quickly to consolidate control. They renamed 18 provinces in the south. For a short time, Ho Chi Minh City was actually called Saigon Gia, before officially becoming Ho Chi Minh City. Then, in 1975, North and South Vietnam were formally reunified under a communist government, establishing the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which was closely aligned with the Soviet Union at the time.
But the immediate post-war period must have presented huge economic challenges for the newly unified nation.
Oh, absolutely massive challenges. The new government implemented sweeping, often quite radical economic policies. This included forced collectivization of agriculture, especially in the South, nationalization of private industries, state monopolies over trade and banking.
How did that work out?
Not well, initially. These policies, combined with the lingering devastation of the war and international isolation, led to severe economic difficulties. Widespread shortages, crippling inflation made worse by a chaotic currency reform, and significant opposition, particularly in the South, which had a long history of a more market-based economy.
So they had to change course.
Eventually, yes. Recognizing the severity of the crisis, some of the most problematic policies were partially reversed as early as 1979, allowing for a limited degree of private sector activity. But the real shift came later.
Which eventually paved the way for the crucial Doi Moi reforms in the late 1980s. What was the significance of that shift?
Doi Moi, meaning renovation, launched officially after the Communist Party's 6th National Congress in 1986, marked a fundamental shift in Vietnam's economic policy. It was huge.
How did it start?
It began with the liberalization of agriculture, basically giving farmers much more autonomy and allowing private land ownership. That single reform had a dramatic, almost immediate positive impact on food production.
And then beyond agriculture.
Subsequently, yeah. The reforms focused on reducing state control over the wider economy, actively encouraging the development of the non-state sector private enterprise, and creating a much more favorable environment for foreign investments. These reforms, especially after 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and that model faded, really propelled Vietnam onto a path of significant economic growth and integration into the global economy.
And modern Vietnam has seen remarkable economic development and much greater engagement with the rest of the world since then.
It really has. Modern Vietnam is, constitutionally, a socialist republic led by the Communist Party. But since Doi Moi, the country has achieved impressive rates of economic growth and development. It's driven by increased domestic and foreign investment, and that ongoing transition towards a more market-oriented economy, sometimes called a socialist-oriented market economy.
Right.
They've adopted modern economic indicators, like the production approach to measuring GDP, and made substantial progress in improving living standards for millions.
It's not just the economy that's transformed, though. The source also mentions a kind of cultural renaissance in modern Vietnam.
Yes, that's true. Alongside the economic transformation, Vietnam has experienced a significant cultural revival. It's reestablished diplomatic and trade relations with the vast majority of countries, ending that long period of relative isolation.
And culturally.
Vietnam boasts this incredibly rich and diverse cultural heritage, which is increasingly being celebrated and promoted its music, art, cuisine. The government has invested in developing cultural infrastructure, too, like cinemas, theaters, art centers. Both traditional art forms and contemporary artistic expressions are flourishing.
You mentioned music specifically.
Yeah, Vietnam has a long and vibrant tradition of music. Broadly speaking, there are two main genres. Folk music, which is deeply rooted in everyday life and varies regionally, and artistic music, which often has a more formal structure and might tell historical or literary stories. Both continue to evolve and find new audiences today.
And on the world stage, Vietnam has become an active and engaged member of the global community.
Definitely. In the post-war era, Vietnam has had to navigate a complex international landscape. Shifting alliances, increasing global competition. Initially, relations with the Soviet Union, France, and China were particularly important for different reasons.
But it's evolved.
Over time, yes. Vietnam has pursued a more independent and multifaceted foreign policy. It's moved from the early years focused on securing aid and navigating Cold War politics through the intense diplomacy during the war years to the adjustments needed after reunification and the Soviet collapse.
And now?
Now it's an active participant in numerous international organizations, most notably ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where it plays a key role in regional cooperation. Vietnam's also served as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, showing its commitment to multilateralism. A key aspect of its current foreign policy is this careful balancing act, protecting its national sovereignty and interests while pursuing peaceful, cooperative relations with all countries, including its large and powerful neighbor, China.
Of course, like any rapidly developing nation, Vietnam faces its own set of challenges and opportunities as it looks to the future.
True. Among the key challenges today is definitely environmental pollution, air, water, soil. The causes are complex: limitations in legal enforcement, sometimes low public awareness, ethical considerations in rapid industrial development. Strengthening environmental protection laws and education is crucial for sustainable development.
And socially.
Social inequalities also remain a concern. While Vietnam has made huge strides in poverty reduction and actually has a lower Gini coefficient, that measure of inequality compared to, say, China, income and wealth inequality have been growing. And while access to education, like school enrollment, has become more equitable, disparities in educational outcomes still persist between different socioeconomic groups and regions.
But there are also significant opportunities for continued progress and growth, presumably.
Absolutely. Ho Chi Minh City, for example, has emerged as a major financial hub in the region, hosting a wide array of financial service providers. This indicates strong potential for further development in banking, especially modern services like internet banking, credit cards, fintech, which are still growing. Continued economic reforms, investment in education and infrastructure, and that active participation in the global economy, these all offer significant opportunities for Vietnam to continue its trajectory of growth.
It's been an incredibly comprehensive journey through thousands of years of history. Wow. To sort of bring it all together, what would you say are the most enduring themes that emerge from Vietnam's past?
Good question. I think we've seen this consistent thread of incredible resilience, right? And a really strong sense of national identity that's allowed Vietnam to withstand these long periods of foreign domination and internal conflict.
Yeah, resilience, definitely.
Also, the ability to adapt and absorb external influences while somehow retaining a unique cultural core. That's another key theme. That long struggle for independence has profoundly shaped the national psyche, And finally, this more recent period of economic reform, Doi Moi, and global integration, it demonstrates Vietnam's dynamism and its aspirations for the future.
That ability to blend external influences with a strong sense of internal identity really stands out, doesn't it? From those early interactions with southern China to the complexities of French colonialism and now its current role on the world stage, Vietnam's story is one of constant adaptation, maybe reinvention even.
Which brings us, I suppose, to a final point for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah.
How does a nation with such a deep and often turbulent history continue to negotiate that delicate balance between honoring its past, preserving its unique cultural heritage, and embracing the powerful forces of modernization and globalization? And what might be the long-term implications of its historical struggles for its current and future role in the international community? What aspect, maybe, of Vietnam's remarkable journey has left the most lasting impression on you?
Definitely some profound questions to ponder there. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the history of Vietnam. It's been fascinating. We really encourage you to continue exploring this incredible nation and its rich, complex past.